Vivian Hale blocked the ballroom doors and looked at James Carter's work boots. Use the back door. 200 gala guests heard her, including the daughter who had secretly called him there. James could leave with his dignity, or stay while the hotel's pipes hammered beneath their feet. Then a champagne tower trembled, and brown water flashed through the glass ceiling above the donors. Elena Hale stepped between her mother and the plumber. He is here because I invited him. What she knew about James's old warning could ruin the celebration, or save everyone inside it. 43 minutes earlier, James had been kneeling under a sink in a third-floor apartment while his 11-year-old daughter, Lily, timed him on her phone. He replaced a corroded trap, wiped the cabinet dry, and showed the tenant exactly what had failed. Honest explanations took longer than vague invoices, but James had built Carter plumbing one kitchen at a time after his wife died. Lily announced that he had 6 minutes left before they needed to drive to her school concert. James held up his red-handled shutoff key, wrapped with the blue tape she had labeled Home First, and promised they would be early. The promise mattered because James had missed the winter concert the year before. A frozen service line had burst at a nursing home, and he had stayed until every resident had heat and water. Lily said she understood, then stopped practicing the song whenever he entered the room. Since then, James kept her school calendar clipped above every work order. That evening, she wore her late mother's silver music note at her neck and had rehearsed a solo for 3 months. James loaded his tools, tucked the shutoff key into its canvas loop, and silenced his work phone as they headed downstairs. The phone rang again before they reached the van. Elena Hale introduced herself as operations director of the Grand Meridian Hotel. A pressure alarm kept resetting across 3 floors. The contracted plumber was unreachable, and a charity gala would begin in 1 hour. She had found James's name on an old engineering memorandum and offered triple emergency rate for a 40-minute inspection. James looked at Lily. She looked at the clock. He said no, politely, because a promise to his daughter was not an empty space someone richer could purchase. Elena did not raise the offer. She asked what a shaking cold water riser might mean. James stopped with his hand on the van door. A shaking riser could mean a failed arrestor, a closed balancing valve, or pressure building behind a weakened joint. Elena added that one ceiling tile had darkened above the ballroom. James told her to clear the area and shut the affected zone. She said the general manager refused to interrupt the gala without proof. Lily heard the entire exchange. She told her father they could spare 40 minutes if he called her music teacher, but only if he let her hold the stopwatch. James made the call, secured Lily in the passenger seat, and drove toward the Grand Meridian with his hazard beacon on. The hotel rose over the river in pale limestone and polished brass, already crowded with donors, staff, photographers, and families from the children's meal program the gala supported. The service lane was blocked by a catering truck whose driver had no key to the loading gate. James phoned Elena twice. Both calls went to a conference line. A pressure problem did not wait for valet etiquette, so James took his tool bag through the public entrance with Lily beside him. He intended to find Elena, inspect the riser, and leave before the first orchestra cue. He did not expect every camera in the lobby to turn toward his stained navy uniform. Vivian Hale saw him before Elena did. At 62, Vivian owned the hotel her husband had restored and wore authority as precisely as her pearl gray suit. She had spent the afternoon promising the board that the Centennial Gala would prove the Meridian was ready for a national expansion. A plumber crossing the marble with a child in a scratched tool bag looked, to her, like disorder made visible. She stepped into his path, held one palm toward his chest without touching him, and said, loudly enough for the arriving donors, that vendors used the back door. Several guests turned. One man lowered his champagne but did not look away. James explained that the loading lane was blocked and that Elena had called about a pressure alarm. Vivian glanced at Lily, then at the dark mark on James's knee, and repeated the order as though he had failed a simple test. Use the back door. The words traveled through the lobby. A photographer captured Vivian standing above him while James held his tool bag and Lily gripped the blue-taped shutoff key. James felt his daughter's fingers close around his sleeve. He wanted to answer with the anger he had swallowed in 100 service entrances. Instead, he asked Vivian to clear the ballroom until he could inspect the ceiling. Vivian's mouth tightened. She said the ballroom had passed inspection that morning and accused James of manufacturing urgency to justify an emergency bill. Her general manager, Grant Mercer, arrived beside her and confirmed that all systems were normal. Grant wore a white dinner jacket and the calm smile of a man accustomed to having his version entered into the record first. He offered to escort James around the building. James told him that every extra minute increased the chance of a joint failure. The nearest riser struck once behind the wall, a heavy metallic knock. Grant called it an old hotel settling. James called it trapped pressure. Elena crossed the lobby before security reached them. She was 36, dressed for the gala but carrying a maintenance tablet under one arm. She did not ask her mother for permission. She stepped between Vivian and James and told the guards to stand down. "He is here because I invited him," she said. Then she faced the crowd and added that James Carter had written the only warning she had found that matched the current pressure pattern. The objection changed the room. Vivian was no longer dismissing an unknown tradesman. She was contradicting her own operations director, and her daughter had chosen the plumber's evidence in public. James asked Elena why she had not mentioned an old warning on the phone. Elena said she had discovered it 20 minutes earlier in a box of her father's project files. Before she could explain more, a server shouted from the ballroom. The champagne tower trembled, glasses chiming against one another, and a narrow stain spread across a ceiling panel. James moved everyone back. Brown water flashed once along the seam and stopped. He listened to the pipe through the wall with a screwdriver against his ear. The silence after the hammer worried him more than the noise. Pressure had found somewhere else to go. Lily reminded him that 27 minutes remained on their timer. James told Elena he would identify the immediate risk, not renovate the hotel, and then leave for the concert. Vivian called that irresponsible. James answered that the irresponsible act was keeping 200 people under a suspect line because embarrassment seemed expensive. Elena backed him. She ordered the ballroom's west section cleared and moved the children's program families to the garden salon. That was her first decision against Grant's advice and her mother's public demand. It cost the hotel its planned entrance, but it gave James a safe working zone. In the service corridor, James found a digital gauge reading 132 pounds per square inch, far above the hotel's normal range. Grant insisted the sensor was faulty. James attached his own calibrated gauge and got 129. He asked for the valve map. Grant produced a glossy renovation plan with no revision marks. Elena opened the old memorandum on her tablet. It carried James's signature from 4 years earlier, when he had been a subcontractor on the Meridian renovation. His report warned that isolating the ballroom branch without adding a relief loop would turn normal pump cycles into repeated hydraulic shocks. James had never known what happened to that report. His employer at the time told him the hotel selected another design, then removed him from the project after he refused to sign the revised pressure test. The job loss came 3 weeks after his wife, Maria, began cancer treatment. James had taken every residential call he could find and never returned to the Meridian. He did not tell Elena all of that. He only pointed to the missing relief loop and said somebody had built the exact configuration he warned against. Grant said the signed inspection proved otherwise. James asked to see the physical valves rather than the signatures. The valve room required a key Grant claimed was in the engineering office. Lily noticed a brass cabinet label under a fresh coat of paint and read the faded word bypass. James let her photograph it but asked her to stay beside Elena, away from the mechanical room. Fatherhood changed the shape of every risk. He could crawl under a failing line himself, but he would not let his daughter stand within its path. Elena assigned a trusted banquet captain named Rosa to remain with Lily and promised that the garden salon doors would stay open. Only then did James follow Grant downstairs. At the basement landing, the pipes shuddered again. James placed one hand on the wall and felt the pulse travel toward the ballroom branch. The access door opened on a cramped room of pumps, gauges, and newly painted pipe. One balancing valve was wired open, while another had been forced, nearly closed. The arrangement made no operational sense unless someone wanted the public gauge to appear stable during inspection. James photographed the positions with Elena's tablet. Grant reached for it. Elena pulled the tablet back and asked why the inspection photographs showed different valve handles. Grant blamed a night technician who had quit the previous week. James saw a cheaper danger. The expansion joint beyond the pumps had begun to separate, leaving a thin ring of mineral residue around its collar. It could hold for an hour or fail in a minute. A full shutdown would protect the guests but cancel the gala, close the kitchens, and trigger a report to the city. A partial isolation might buy time if James could reopen the bypass slowly. Grant wanted the partial fix. Vivian, listening through Elena's speakerphone, ordered them to keep the ballroom open. James looked at the home first tape on his shutoff key and said he would not gamble with other families to preserve anyone's schedule. Elena asked what a safe plan required. James answered with 3 steps: evacuate the threatened zone, reduce pump speed, and reopen the bypass in measured increments while monitoring both sides. Grant said only hotel engineering could authorize pump changes. Elena used her operations credentials and issued the order herself. The ballroom orchestra stopped mid-rehearsal. Staff guided guests into the lobby and garden salon while rumors moved faster than instructions. Vivian descended to the valve room, furious that her daughter had disrupted the largest fundraiser of the year. Elena did not retreat. She asked her mother whether a perfect gala mattered more than a safe one. Vivian told James he had 15 minutes. He said pressure did not negotiate, then handed Elena his gauge so she could read each change aloud. He opened the bypass 1/8 of a turn. The upstream needle dropped, but the downstream gauge jumped. Somewhere above them, a pipe knocked twice. James stopped. The response meant the branch map was wrong, or another valve had been hidden during renovation. Grant claimed there was no hidden line. Lily's photograph of the painted cabinet label suggested otherwise. Elena enlarged it and found an old room number beneath the word bypass. The room had been converted into a wine storage closet. They crossed a service hall where cooks were trying to keep dinner warm without running the dish station. James noticed a prep sink beginning to backflow. He shut its local supply before contaminated water could reach the food line, then showed the kitchen chief how to isolate the neighboring fixtures. It was a small test of competence, witnessed by workers who had heard Vivian shame him upstairs. James did not perform for them. He labeled every closed valve so the night crew would not inherit a mystery. Elena watched him protect people who could offer him nothing, even while the clock for Lily's concert continued to fall. The wine closet had been built over the old bypass access. Grant said opening the finished wall would require owner approval and a construction crew. James tapped the panel, found a hollow section, and located the original service hatch behind a removable rack. He could reach it without damaging the stonework if the bottles were moved. Vivian objected that the collection was insured for more than James's annual income. Elena ordered the staff to move it anyway, 1 case at a time. She carried the first case herself. That second action changed the staff's behavior. They stopped waiting for Grant and began following the safety plan. Behind the rack, James found a capped relief loop and a manual valve coated in clean dust except for 1 bright scrape. Someone had operated it recently, then concealed it again. He asked who knew about the access. Grant said dozens of contractors did. Rosa, listening from the doorway, said Grant had cleared the wine room alone before the morning inspection. Grant dismissed her memory as gossip. Elena recorded the statement and sealed the room log. Vivian accused her daughter of turning an emergency into an inquisition. Elena replied that the emergency existed because everyone had accepted Grant's answers before checking the pipes. James opened the hidden valve gradually. Pressure began to equalize, and the hammer softened from a blow to a tremor. For a moment, relief passed through the room. Then water appeared at the expansion joint, 1 clear bead after another. The collar had already been weakened by months of stress. James could install a temporary restraint, but the system still required shutdown before the evening ended. Grant suggested wrapping the joint and reopening the ballroom for photographs. James refused. A temporary restraint was for controlled depressurization, not permission to continue loading a damaged system. His refusal turned Grant's irritation into open hostility. Grant asked Vivian why they were trusting a plumber fired from the original renovation. James corrected him. The subcontractor had removed him after he refused to certify the redesign. Grant knew that detail even though Elena had never mentioned it. The room went quiet. Elena asked how Grant knew. He said the fact appeared in the old file, but the file on her tablet contained only James's report. Vivian looked at Grant for the first time with uncertainty. James did not press the advantage. He asked for pipe clamps, rubber sheet, threaded rod, and the maintenance crew members who knew the pump controls. Lily called from the garden salon. Her teacher could delay the solo by 12 minutes, no more. James glanced at the clock and calculated the drive. If he left immediately, he could still make it. The joint was stable enough for the hotel's licensed engineer to complete shutdown, provided Grant did not reverse the settings. Elena promised to stand at the pump panel herself. James packed his wrench. Vivian interpreted the movement as abandonment and said she would ensure no hotel in the city hired him again. Lily heard the threat through the open call. James closed his eyes, then told Vivian his daughter had already paid enough for his emergency work. Elena walked James toward the lobby. Along the way, the kitchen chief reported another pressure spike on the East Branch, a section the renovation plan showed as independent. James stopped. If the East Branch reacted to the ballroom bypass, the two lines had been cross-connected. Shutting one could force the entire load into the other. The hotel engineer would not know that from the official drawings. James could leave and keep his promise, or stay and prevent a failure that only he had recognized. He knelt so his eyes were level with Lily's on the video call and admitted he might miss her solo again. Lily was quiet long enough for James to feel the old failure returning. Then she asked whether people could get hurt if he left. He said Elena could evacuate them, but the kitchens, guest rooms, and children's wing might flood. Lily touched her music note and told him a promise meant telling the truth when the plan changed, not pretending nothing else mattered. She would sing the solo into Rosa's phone if he listened live. James told her he was proud of her, though the words caught in his throat. Fatherhood did not remove his duty to the hotel. It taught him that duty required honesty, consent, and a cost shared openly. James returned to the valve room on one condition. Elena would order a full building water shutdown and move every guest from the affected floors. Vivian said that would destroy the gala. Elena answered that she was willing to put her job behind the decision. She signed the emergency order on her tablet and sent copies to the city desk, the board chair, and every department head before Grant could block it. That was her third plot-changing action. She did not merely believe James. She attached her own status to the consequences of his judgment. The shutdown exposed a second problem. Pump number 3 ignored the command and continued cycling. Grant said its controller sometimes lagged. James traced the control cable to a recently installed override box bearing the renovation vendor's label. The box kept the pump running whenever ballroom demand dropped, masking low-pressure complaints during peak events. It also created the repeated shocks now splitting the joint. Elena photographed the wiring and called the vendor from the number printed on the panel. The technician who answered said Grant had personally requested the override 2 months earlier and described it as a temporary occupancy fix. Grant tried to take Elena's phone. James stepped between them without touching him. Vivian ordered security into the room, but this time she told them to watch Grant. He claimed the override prevented guests from losing water and saved the hotel from an expensive shutdown during high season. He had planned to replace the joint after the gala when the quarterly report was complete. Vivian asked whether he had told the morning inspector. Grant said the inspector had seen stable readings. James pointed to the wired valves and hidden controller. Stable readings manufactured by concealed pressure were not a past system. They were a lie with plumbing around it. The temporary restraint required 2 people to hold alignment while a third tightened the rods. James asked the hotel engineer, Malik, to take the safe side. He assigned Grant no role. Vivian removed her jacket and offered to help, but James refused because she lacked the training and because accountability was not proven by stepping into a hazard for 1 dramatic minute. He asked her instead to keep the corridor clear and ensure every worker was counted. Vivian accepted the less visible task. For the first time that evening, she followed instructions from the man she had ordered to a back door. As James fitted the rubber sheet, Elena held his work light and read the gauges. She admitted she had searched for him after discovering her father's handwritten note attached to the old report. If this line ever starts talking, call Carter. He listens before the building screams. Elena's father, Thomas Hale, had believed James 4 years ago, but a stroke removed him from the renovation before the dispute was settled. Vivian had assumed Thomas approved the final plan because Grant presented the completion binder with his electronic signature. Elena had called James because the note was personal, specific, and unlike anything her father wrote casually. That was the withheld answer behind her public objection. Elena had not defended a stranger out of rebellion or attraction. She had followed a warning her father left for the day the hotel's polished paperwork contradicted its bones. James felt no triumph. Thomas had tried to preserve the truth, and James had spent 4 years believing nobody had listened. The knowledge changed his anger, but did not erase Vivian's humiliation or Grant's choices. He tightened the first rod and told Elena that a dead man's note could start an investigation, but only living people could decide what happened next. Pressure fell below 90. The collar held. Staff applauded from the corridor until James asked them to save it for the complete shutdown. He connected to Lily's concert through Rosa's phone and set the device on a dry toolbox. While Malik turned the final pump off, Lily stepped onto the school stage miles away. Her voice entered the mechanical room thin through the speaker, then steadied. James kept one hand on the restraint and listened to every word. Elena lowered the work light so the glare would not hit the screen. Vivian stood outside the hazard line and watched him keep both responsibilities the only way he could. When the song ended, James applauded with wet gloves. Lily smiled into the camera and held up the silver music note. The joint stopped weeping as system pressure reached 0. For one breath, the evening seemed saved. Then alarms sounded from the 7th floor, where a fire suppression tank registered rapid loss. Malik said the fire system was designed to be independent. James looked at the cross-connection marks and realized the renovation had tied a domestic makeup line into the tank controls. Their shutdown had revealed another unauthorized shortcut. The hotel could not legally remain occupied without a verified fire reserve. Elena ordered a full evacuation. Vivian hesitated only once, looking toward the ballroom where the foundation donors waited. Then she took the public address microphone and announced the closure herself. She did not blame a vendor or call it an abundance of caution. She said the hotel had discovered an unsafe condition and that every guest would be moved to the partner property across the square. The admission cost her the gala, the headlines, and perhaps the expansion vote. It also moved the story beyond James, proving his competence. Vivian had begun to accept responsibility where everyone could hear it. Outside, rain had begun, and 200 guests filled the covered hotel arcade while buses arrived. Grant disappeared during the evacuation. Elena found the renovation binder missing from his office and the security archive remotely deleting. She used her own executive key to freeze the network account, then asked the board chair to preserve every maintenance record. The chair warned that a public scandal could collapse financing. Elena answered that financing built on concealed safety failures deserved to collapse. James heard the exchange while checking the fire connection. Trust between them had progressed from observed competence to reciprocal protection, and now to costly choice. City inspectors arrived before midnight. Grant returned with an attorney and claimed James had altered the valves, caused the pressure loss, and exceeded the scope of his license. The accusation was plausible enough to frighten Vivian. James had touched every key component and had no signed work order beyond an inspection. Grant demanded that security seize his tools as evidence. In the crowded arcade, the same guests who had watched Vivian shame James now watched a guard reach for his bag. Lily stood beside Rosa, still wearing her concert clothes. James placed the bag on the floor voluntarily but kept the red-handled shutoff key in sight. The lead inspector, Dana Brooks, asked for a timeline. James gave one without embellishment, including every valve he had operated and every instruction Elena had issued. Grant supplied a printed log showing normal pressure until James entered the building. Lily whispered that the times were wrong. She had started her stopwatch when Elena called, and her phone showed the first alarm screenshot 11 minutes before their arrival. James did not put his daughter forward as a weapon. He asked permission to share the phone record, and Lily agreed. The ordinary timer that had measured a father's promise became the first independent check against Grant's manufactured timeline. Elena produced her tablet photographs, Rosa's statement, and the vendor call recording. Grant's attorney argued that each item could be misunderstood. Vivian remained silent until Dana asked who authorized the override. Grant pointed to Thomas Hale's electronic signature in the completion binder. Elena opened her father's medical calendar. The signature was dated 2 days after his stroke, while he was unconscious in intensive care. Vivian recognized the date before anyone explained it. She had sat beside Thomas that entire day. The document she had trusted for 4 years could not have been approved by him. Vivian asked Grant whether he forged the signature. Grant said an assistant applied a standing authorization and that Thomas would have approved a cost-saving fix. James interrupted only to correct the word fix. The override did not fix a design error. It hid symptoms while increasing stress. Dana agreed and ordered the system sealed for forensic inspection. The hotel would remain closed. Grant turned on Vivian, reminding her that she had demanded 0 interruption during expansion season. Vivian admitted she had created pressure for impossible results. but she had never authorized falsifying a dead man's approval or risking guests. Her accountability did not excuse him, and his fraud did not excuse her. The inspectors released James's tools after photographing them. One socket was missing. Grant's attorney suggested James had left it inside the override box, implying he installed the device. James knew he had not used that size all night, but memory alone would not prove it. Lily pointed to the canvas loops. Maria had sewn each loop to fit a specific tool, and the empty one was narrow. The missing socket was a half-inch deep well, while the override box required a metric driver. Dana documented the mismatch. A hotel security guard later found the socket beneath Grant's desk, placed there too quickly and without understanding James's kit. Grant was not arrested in a theatrical sweep. The city referred the forged authorization, evidence tampering, and safety violations to investigators while the board suspended him. That slower consequence felt more credible and more dangerous. He still had allies, contracts, and access to records. Elena told James the hotel needed an independent technical account before morning. He agreed to write only what he personally observed. He would not inflate certainty to help her win a family fight. His boundary frustrated Elena, but it also proved that his loyalty could not be purchased by gratitude any more than his silence could be purchased by Vivian's threat. At 2 a.m, James and Lily sat in the partner hotel's employee cafeteria with paper cups of cocoa. Lily asked whether he had chosen the hotel over her. James told her he had made her carry the cost of his choice, even after promising not to. Saving people did not automatically make that fair. He apologized without asking her to praise him. Lily said watching him listen to her song from the valve room was different from an empty chair, but she wanted a rule. Next time, he must tell her before saying yes to the emergency. They rewrote Home First on fresh blue tape together. Elena joined them without her gala dress jacket and asked Lily's permission to sit. She thanked Lily for the timestamp, then offered the hotel ballroom for a private concert after repairs. Lily declined. She wanted her father at the next ordinary school event, not a grand replacement arranged by rich people. Elena accepted the answer. That small exchange mattered to James. She did not treat his daughter as a bridge to him or a problem money could solve. She listened to a boundary and let it stand. Trust moved through vulnerability rather than spectacle. By dawn, online photographs had reduced the night to a single frame. Vivian above James, her palm blocking him, the words "use the back door" printed in yellow by strangers. The image threatened to define both of them. Vivian called a press conference for noon. Her advisors drafted a statement praising James as an exceptional contractor and blaming Grant as a rogue employee. James refused to attend if the statement pretended the public humiliation had been a misunderstanding. Vivian had meant the words. The repair had to begin with truth, not a cleaner version of the same hierarchy. Elena agreed with him, risking another rupture with her mother. Vivian accused Elena of enjoying the chance to take control. Elena admitted she wanted leadership, but not through her mother's public collapse. She wanted a hotel where a warning mattered before the person giving it displayed wealth or a title. Vivian asked James what he expected, perhaps money, perhaps a board seat. James said he expected her to name the behavior, explain the safety failure, and protect workers who reported bad news. He did not need her to call him extraordinary. Ordinary people deserved the front door too. At the press conference, Vivian stood in the same lobby and used no euphemism. She said she had publicly demeaned James Carter because of his uniform and had ignored a safety warning because listening would disrupt an important event. She apologized to James, to Lily, and to hotel workers who had learned that rank mattered more than evidence. Then she announced an independent review, paid leave for affected staff, and a reporting line outside hotel management. She did not ask James to forgive her on camera. The absence of that demand gave the apology its first measure of dignity. Reporters asked James whether Vivian's apology was enough. He said an apology was a door, not the room beyond it. The hotel would prove its values through the next inconvenient warning. He credited Malik, Rosa, Elena, Lily, and the workers who evacuated guests. He refused the hero story because it would let the system celebrate one plumber instead of changing how it heard every cleaner, cook, guard, and technician. The answer spread farther than the humiliating photograph, not because it was polished, but because James placed dignity where status had been. The board hired an independent engineering firm. Their investigation found that Grant had redirected renovation funds to a vendor partly owned by his brother-in-law, used cheaper valve layouts, and installed overrides to suppress guest complaints. 2 earlier maintenance reports had been reclassified as cosmetic noise. James's 4-year-old memorandum was intact in Thomas Hale's files but absent from the official archive. Each reveal had been prepared by the wrong valve positions: the painted access label, Grant's knowledge of James's dismissal, the vendor call, and the impossible signature date. No single miracle document solved the case. The report also found Vivian had rewarded managers for 0 service interruptions without creating a safety exception. Her metric did not order anyone to forge records, but it made honest shutdowns look like personal failure. Vivian resigned as chief executive while remaining owner under board oversight. Elena was offered the interim role. She accepted only after negotiating authority for an independent safety committee with elected worker seats. Her choice cost her the uncomplicated victory she once wanted. She would lead under public scrutiny and with limits she had helped design. James received an offer to supervise all Meridian plumbing contracts at a salary that could erase his debts. The job required travel to 6 cities and constant availability. 4 years earlier, during Maria's treatment, he would have accepted before reading the second page. Now he brought the offer home and reviewed it with Lily at their kitchen table. The money promised security, but the schedule recreated the absence they were trying to repair. Lily did not tell him what to choose. James asked the hotel for a local consulting contract with fixed emergency boundaries and trained backups instead. Elena expected the hotel to reject his counteroffer. Instead, the worker committee supported it because the plan trained Malik's team rather than making safety depend on one heroic outsider. James would audit the repaired system, teach pressure diagnostics, and remain unavailable during protected family hours unless life safety required a shared call with Lily. The contract paid less than the executive position but built a system that could function without sacrificing one person. Vivian signed it without negotiating the boundaries away. That was not redemption completed, but it was behavior changing under inconvenience. Repairs took 8 weeks. James found Elena in meetings, mechanical rooms, and once on the loading dock helping Rosa test the new reporting line. Their relationship grew in small, unmarketable moments. Elena brought evidence before asking for trust. James admitted when he did not know an answer. They argued about reopening dates and learned neither disagreement nor attraction required surrender. Lily watched for grand gestures and found none. What convinced her was Elena arriving at a Saturday school cleanup in old clothes, staying after photographers left, and asking which paintbrush needed washing. Vivian struggled with the new limits. During a contractor meeting, she interrupted a housekeeper who reported a chemical odor and nearly dismissed it as routine. Then she stopped, apologized, and cleared the room for testing. The odor came from a mislabeled cleaning concentrate, not a major emergency. In the old culture, a harmless finding would have been used to mock future reports. Vivian thanked the housekeeper anyway. James observed that dignity could not depend on every warning becoming a catastrophe. Listening had value even when the worst fear proved false. Grant's case proceeded through audits and hearings rather than a convenient confession. He claimed Vivian's demands had forced his shortcuts. The evidence showed he profited from them, but his defense kept the hotel's culture under examination. Elena testified that leadership pressure and individual fraud could coexist. Vivian testified without asking immunity from embarrassment. James described only the mechanics he witnessed. Lily was not called. Her timestamp remained authenticated through phone records, sparing her the burden of performing the night again for adults. The reopening date landed on the same week as Lily's spring concert. Elena scheduled the hotel ceremony for the afternoon so James would not face another manufactured choice. Vivian suggested moving Lily's concert into the restored ballroom as a symbolic event. Elena reminded her of Lily's earlier refusal. Vivian let the idea go. That quiet restraint showed more growth than a speech. The family bridge in the story did not mean absorbing Lily into the Hale brand. It meant powerful adults learning that her ordinary life had its own center. On reopening day, the Grand Meridian's front entrance displayed no portrait of James and no plaque calling him a savior. Instead, a brass panel beside the staff corridor listed the names of every employee empowered to issue a safety stop. Rosa's name appeared beside Malik's and dozens of others. The old vendor sign saying service entrance only had been removed. Delivery workers still used the loading dock when appropriate, but no one could turn a practical route into a verdict on human worth. James inspected the new relief loop, signed the pressure test he had refused 4 years earlier, and kept a copy. Vivian found James in the lobby before guests arrived. She returned the original memorandum from Thomas's files in an archival sleeve. James said the hotel should keep the original as part of the investigation record. Vivian agreed and handed him a certified copy instead. She told him Thomas had trusted his ear. James answered that Thomas had trusted evidence, which was better. Vivian asked whether he could ever forgive the scene at the ballroom doors. James said forgiveness was possible, but it would not erase the duty to remember what made those words feel natural to her. Elena opened the ceremony by inviting Malik and Rosa to explain the new system. She spoke last and briefly. When a reporter asked why James was not on stage, she pointed to the mechanical gallery where he was teaching apprentices how to compare two gauges instead of trusting a single display. The image captured that day showed workers gathered around a pipe, not a rich family presenting a reward. Elena had learned that sharing power meant giving up the most flattering version of the story. That evening, James sat in the third row of Lily's school auditorium 10 minutes early. His phone was on, because emergencies existed, but Malik held primary duty and understood the system. Lily walked onto the stage, found her father's face, and smiled before the first note. James did not film the entire song. He listened. The home first shutoff key rested in his van, still wrapped in blue tape, no longer a symbol of choosing one duty over another. It had become a reminder to build enough honesty and support that love did not always have to lose when responsibility called. After the concert, Elena waited outside with 2 paper cups of cocoa, not a limousine or a press photographer. She had asked Lily beforehand whether joining them would feel intrusive. Lily accepted 1 cup and made Elena promise not to discuss valves for at least 20 minutes. James laughed. The 3 walked toward the parking lot while Lily described every mistake the audience had not noticed. Nothing about the moment declared a new family complete. It showed the beginning of earned closeness, protected by the boundaries that had made trust possible. 6 months later, the children's meal program held its fundraiser in the restored ballroom. The kitchen ran on the new system, and every pressure reading was visible to staff on a simple panel James helped design. Vivian greeted delivery crews at the same doors as donors during the busy arrival period. She was still capable of impatience, but workers no longer went silent around it. Elena led the hotel with the committee she had promised. James remained an independent plumber, present for Lily's routines and available to the Meridian through a team rather than a permanent emergency. Lily hung her concert program beside Maria's old sewing kit in their kitchen. The canvas tool loops Maria had stitched were repaired, including the one Grant tried to exploit. James understood then why the bag had mattered throughout the night. It began as an ordinary burden he carried through a grand lobby. It became evidence because someone who loved him had made every place specific. In the end, it was not proof that he was secretly important. It was proof that an ordinary life, carefully tended, could resist being rewritten by people with louder titles. Vivian's command had been only 4 words, but it carried an old belief. Some people entered through the front because they belonged, while others remained useful only when unseen. James did not defeat that belief by becoming richer, more famous, or indispensable. He defeated it by refusing both humiliation and hero worship. Elena changed the hotel by attaching her authority to evidence and accepting limits on her own power. Lily changed her father by insisting that service without honest boundaries could become another form of abandonment. Dignity is not the reward a powerful person gives after a worker proves exceptional. It is the starting condition owed before anyone knows what he can save. A promise to family is not preserved by ignoring every emergency, nor honored by disappearing into every crisis. It is preserved through truth, consent, and systems that do not demand the same good person's sacrifice alone. The strongest door in the Grand Meridian was never the polished entrance. It was the one people learned to hold open when an inconvenient voice arrived with evidence. If you had been James, would you have walked away to keep the promise, or stayed to protect strangers? Share your choice below, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who refuse to surrender their dignity.